you're doing a wonderful job here. Uh, This morning, we're gonna do things a little bit differently. We have a few board members out, so in order to maintain a quorum, we are gonna go into committee as a whole for both finance and academics, which will allow all of our members to vote this morning during committee meetings. So, ready? So action item number 1, we have the certification of intercollegiate athletic budgets, which begins on page 1-1 of the agenda book. Mr. Nick Fuller will provide background for this item.
Good morning, everyone. This is the budgeted athletic revenues for the public institutions for the fiscal year that began July 1. These items were all reported to us in June of this year. And then you will see at our October meeting, we will present the actual expenditures from the previous fiscal year. As for the budgeted athletic revenues and expenditures, you'll see the athletic fees that are being presented for this year for each campus. There are only 2 institutions that increase those athletic fees, and there is one that decreased their athletic fee. And there are a few different reports. We present slides showing you the various amounts of revenues projected for each campus. And you'll see there is a limit of up to 2% of their educational and general budget that they can transfer in order to fund athletic for each year. Then the last slide is the budgeted expenses. Are there any questions in regard to the budgeted athletic expenditures or revenues for fiscal 25?
Any questions? Since there are no questions, do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the certification of intercollegiate athletic budgets?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Moving on to action agenda item number 2. This is the productivity-based funding distribution for 2025-26, which begins on page 2-1 of the agenda book. Mr. Fuller will provide background for this item.
Thank you. This is the 8th year of our productivity funding model distribution recommendations. See, the baseline metrics used for these calculations include academic years 2020 through 2022, with the comparative metric years being academic year 21 through 23. For this year, we did see an overall increase in productivity for the institutions of 0.12%. That results in a recommendation for funding of the institutions of $582.6 million. In accordance with the productivity distribution policy, we will never recommend less than in an overall amount that we had in the prior years. So that does still leave us a balance of $5.8 million that will need to be recommended for statewide purposes to ensure we don't recommend an overall lesser amount for higher ed. And you'll see on this next slide is the distribution between the 2-year and 4-year institutions. There were the total new funding recommended for the campuses was $682,000. That is split $500,000 for the 4-year campuses and $171,000 for the 2 years. This is based on the percentage breakdown of those overall funds from the beginning. The 4-year campuses make up 75% of the overall higher ed funding to begin with. Next slide shows the calculation we get to determine the base level funding for that 26 recommendation. This is removing incentive funds from the prior year where campuses were recommended funds higher than 2% above their previous base. So we reduce those one-time incentive funds to determine the new base funding for each year. The next slide shows the 4-year recommendation for the new funding. You'll see there are 4 institutions that were positive. So we'll see the split of that new funding. And then in the red column, you'll see the reallocation of funds from the schools that were negative in the model to those 4 institutions that were positive. And those amounts are based on how much each school contributed to the increase is how they get the split on how much of the new funding they receive. So the next slide does show the total of recommended funding for each institution for the 4 years. And you see the total funding is $436 million. And there are 2 institutions that will still exceed that 2% cap on base increases. So they will receive one-time funds again in 26 of $780,000. The next few slides are the breakdown of the 2-year institutions. You'll see there are 3 out of the 22 institutions that were positive. I'm sorry, there should be 4. Yes, the top one does not have the incentive fund shown, but there are 4 institutions that were positive. I apologize. Out of 22. So there's the 171,000 of new funding distributed and a reallocation of 1.2 million from those with negative productivity to the 4 with positive. So that results in a $146 million recommendation for funding for the 2-year campuses. And 2 of those institutions do exceed that 2% cap on base level increases. Are there any questions on the productivity distribution?
Nick, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Once an institution receives productivity money,
Yes, sir.
is that continuing money in their budget every year, or does it only affect that 1 year?
Up to that additional 2% that can be added to their base funding, it will be included in the recommendations of the next year when we calculate them.
So it's
But-
continuing in the budget once it enters there as a productivity.
Well, and that will depend on their productivity the next year as well, though. If they're negative productivity the next year, they may lose funding from that amount. But anything they are positive does get rolled into their base calculation for the next year, up to an increase of 2%. So if you look at the chart that we have on the screen now, Black River Technical College, BRTC, they're about 6th or 7th down. See, their recommended funding is $7.1 million. That includes a $120,000 increase to their base.
Yeah.
So that will be part of their base funding for the next year's calculation. But that $1 million in the last column, they will only get one time for the 1 year because it exceeds the 2% increase that's allowed to their base.
Okay.
So we consider that incentive funding that they only receive for one year at a time.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the productivity-based funding distribution for 2025-26?
Second.
Okay. Action agenda item number 3. The operating recommendations for 2025 through 27 begin on page 3-1 of the agenda book. Mr. Fuller will provide background for this item as well.
Thank you. This will encompass part of that productivity recommendation that we just approved, but this is authorizing the recommendations for state funding levels or state spending authority, really, for the 26-27 biennium upcoming this session that starts in the spring. What this does is takes that recommendation from the productivity funding and also adds in other state revenues, which are Educational Excellence Trust Fund and Workforce 2000 funding, to get a total recommendation for that spending limit that each campus can use. We also have non-formula entities that receive recommendations through this. Those are entities that do not generate full-time equivalent students. So they have a separate recommendation phase, and that includes a 7% continuing level increase to their current appropriation spending authority levels. And that is based on the higher education price index for the previous year. And also any additional program enhancement requests that those non-formula entities submit to us. In addition to those levels for the state treasury for the productivity institutions, the division staff is recommending an additional 5% spending authority increase above the funding levels. This is to account for any fluctuation within forecast revenues for those additional funds, the Educational Excellence Workforce 2000. The current levels are based on current year revenues, and we won't know the forecast for the next year until we get to that year. So we want to account for any increases that may happen with those recommendations. You can see the total funding for campuses for the base level was 676 million. That's encompassing the Educational Excellence Workforce 2000 again, because the revenue from the previous slide was only 582 million. And then the non-formula entities account for $230 million of base funding. And their recommendation is for an increase of 25 million for those non-formula entities. I will say the productivity model has been funded each year the past 8 years. When it comes to the non-formula entities, those have not been as lucky on getting those increases that we recommend over the past few years. They have been held pretty flat on those recommendations, but we do continue to make the recommendation for increases. The costs and inflation do go up each year. And then the next few slides, this one shows the 4-year recommendations. Again, you will see the 5% adjustment in the next last column for those spending fluctuations. Then the 2-year institutions. And then the non-formula entities are listed on the next slide. And then the last slide is the UAMS with the health non-formula entity. Are there any questions on the operating recommendations?
If there are no questions, do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the operating recommendations for 2025 through 27? Second. Action agenda item number 4, the personal services recommendations for institution personnel for 2025 through 2027 biennium begin on page 4-1 of the agenda book. Mr. Fuller will provide background for this item.
Thank you. This again is another recommendation for the upcoming biennial session that will begin in the spring. So for position authorized levels and line item salary maximums for all of the positions for campuses, the line item maximum salaries for each of these positions were increased by the same 7% higher education price index change. The recommendations for new positions were based on salaries for similar positions at other campuses. Currently, institutions have 27,058 positions authorized, with the exclusion of UAMS. We count those separately on the health side. The ADHE staff is recommending an increase of 52 positions, which accounts for a 0.2% increase in the overall authorized position levels to 27,110. I will make mention in the transition over the past few years, we moved from classified to non-classified positions for all authorized levels in the campuses. In that change we've made in the previous year, the last year, we reduced over 1,000 positions from campus authorized levels. So we have made a concerted effort to reduce those overall authorized levels, even though it shows a slight increase here this year. And then for UAMS, they have a currently authorized level position level of 11,974 positions. They are not requesting any change in that level. Their request only involves shifting some titles to different levels without an increase or decrease. And there's a chart in your agenda book, I believe, that shows all of the changes for each one, and I have a slide of those. But if you have any questions on the personnel recommendations.
Nick,
Yes, sir.
if an institution is wanting to add a classified position, what's the process they have to go through in order to add that classified position?
We don't have any classified positions anymore. Every position on a campus is a non-classified title.
Okay. So does the process change for requesting one?
No, sir. No, if they are wanting one for the upcoming biennium, they enter in this request. that they're wanting to increase or add additional positions. If it's in the interim time between the sessions, we have a mechanism for them to request to the legislative committee for a growth pool for interim time. We have a pool set up that they can request positions if something comes up in the interim that they can ask for and go to the legislature for approval.
So the legislature has the final approval?
Yes, sir. They have the final approval on any of this. These are going to be the recommendations from our board to the legislature for those levels anyway. That's what we're approving here today, is the coordinating board's recommendation for what those levels should be. And then this will be presented to the legislature in November in the budget hearings.
Okay, that's changed a little bit.
So that's been the standard procedure that I've had to deal with for the past
All right.
10 years or so.
Any other questions? Do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board the approval of the personal services recommendation for institution personnel for the 2025 through 2027 biennium? Mhm. Do I have a second? Thank you. Mhm. Moving on to action agenda item number 5. This is the economic feasibility for South Arkansas College, which begins on page 5-1 of the agenda book.
Get to a little more of our routine work that we do each meeting. This item is for a loan feasibility recommendation for South Arkansas College for a loan of $4 million with a term of up to 20 years at a rate of approximately 7.5%. This will be for educational and general purposes, and revenue will come from tuition and fees as well as sales tax revenue from the campus. Proceeds from the loan will be used to construct a new facility that will house procurement, maintenance, custodial staff, and shipping and receiving for the campus. And then there are representatives from the institution here to answer any questions you may have in regard to this loan. Any questions?
Yes,
This,
just seeing if there are any questions. So I think my only question is just making sure as campuses have more and more buildings available on them, because we're seeing more and more online enrollment, is the construction of a new facility for this really necessary? Somebody from the college to speak for that, that would be wonderful.
Yes, I'm the Vice President of Finance and Administration. We're actually going to have to remove 2 buildings and combine those into this one building. One that's highway construction related and one that another building will be constructed in the future on that side.
That's
One
helpful. So-
question.
So the highway department's working with you on this then?
Yes, we have received funding for some of those funds,
Okay.
for the property that they purchased for that.
Okay.
One question. You indicated that the rate may be 7.5%.
That's the max. We do have a quote from a local bank that would give us 5.5. So we're hoping that it doesn't even get to 4 million, but with not doing bids yet, we don't know exactly what that number will be. But 7.5 would be the absolute max that it would be. We're anticipating it to be about 5.5 at the most.
Well, I'm interested in the rating on the bonds as much as anything. Public schools go out and sell bonds for 4 and 4.5%, so forth. Why are the
We-
bonds on this so much more expensive?
Well, we do have some future buildings that will be happening on bonds. We were kind of looking at some options to load a local loan on this. We do have funds to pay for this building, but we're trying not to use that because we do have some future opportunities that could require that. We haven't made a decision what exactly we will do funding on that. We didn't want to do that until we had approval to move forward. So, and we've been talking to some bond agencies, so it may be that we go to that, and we've received some we have not gotten quotes back from them, but we're working on some options, so it may be even at 4% or something like that. We're just we're trying to work through the process and not get approval for something before we have official approval to proceed.
Well, I'm just wondering, are the rating on the bonds different for ratings for high school bonds?
They could,
What? I mean, do these have an A rating or a B rating or what? do they
it would
have?
be a B, probably an A minus rating.
A minus?
Mhm. We haven't been down a loan or bond request, only twice in 25 years. So we're a little bit new to this process and trying to weed through that. Our last one was in 2016, for lighting upgrades. And before that, it was in 2009 on a building. So we are familiar with the process that we're going through. So we're kind of trying to weed through it cautiously.
Dr. Cash, I think the 7.5% you see there is really their attempt to under promise and over deliver. I think that they're all signs point that their bond rates should come in much lower than 7.5.
Yeah, it's
That is the top end that we would even work with. And like I said, we have companies that we've worked with, banks and bond agencies that have told us that they would be less than. Even our own bank is quoted as less than that, and we're making 6.06% interest on our checking account right now. So we would be nearly recovering whatever that was from the interest that we're making on our checking account right now.
okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Might need the name of your bank.
We're pretty happy with it right now. Most people don't get that kind of money, so we're like, "Well."
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the economic feasibility for South Arkansas College?
I'll make
Second. And then our final action item for finance this morning is the economic feasibility for Arkansas State University system, which begins on page 6-1 of the agenda book. Mr. Nick Coolidge.
Thank you. And with this item, there are two parts to it. The first piece, we're requesting to make a change to our policy in regard to the college savings bond loan program. Currently, the interest rate for this loan program is calculated as the yield rate of 1-year treasury bonds published the third Thursday of the month prior to the board meeting, plus a sliding scale margin based on the term of the loan. So it's not the easiest thing to calculate each time someone wants to make a request. And I think the last time we looked at it, it's right around 5.5%. What we would like to do is recommend to change this to a flat rate that is the same as the new Sustainable Building Maintenance Fund that you'll see rules for later in this meeting, which is 0.2%. The intent of these programs from the state was to make sure that campuses had access to a low interest loan rather than having to go out to the bank as much as we had funding available. So using the calculations is putting it right at what they would get if they went out to market anyway. So we didn't see the need to have such high interest rates on those. And the 0.2% would still allow us to make all of the administrative cost payments with the processing and fees, maintenance fees on those loans. So that is our recommendation to update the policy first before this. And then as for the loan itself, this is for the ASU system as a whole. They're requesting a $2.9 million loan with a term of 10 years at estimate rate of the 0.2%. It's for educational and general purposes. It'll be funded through tuition and fee revenue from the system campuses. It'll be used for various critical and deferred maintenance, renovation, and projects across the ASU system. And representatives from the institution are here if you have any questions in regard to the loan issue.
One question again.
Yes, sir.
Why wouldn't the colleges refer to this revolving loan fund as opposed to selling bonds? Why didn't South Arkansas look at this as opposed to selling bonds?
There is like a waiting list that the campuses have to get on as the funds accumulate into this fund, as the prior loans pay back. Once the funds get up to a high enough level, then we can issue another loan from that. And ASU was next on the list to be able to receive.
Okay,
So the schools just have to request to get put on the list for to be the next one. And then there's just a pecking order waiting list as those funds become available that we can issue loans from.
okay, thanks.
Would someone from the ASU system mind kind of walking us through what they have planned for their projects on this?
I'm Robin Myers, president of Arkansas State University System, and I believe Julie Bates, our vice president for finance, will probably answer all of your questions.
And more.
Julie Bates, Executive Vice President and CFO for the ASU system. Will you repeat the question?
I just wanted to, it says that there's just kind of various deferred maintenance renovation projects across the system. I just wanted to see if you kind of had a breakdown of those for us.
Chairman,
Mhm.
we actually have our Board of Trustees
Mhm.
every year approves a capital expense budget,
Mhm.
and they approve projects for maintenance, renovation, and other capital items. So we plan to utilize that plan from our Board of Trustees to distribute those funds. And it will be related to deferred maintenance and other critical maintenance issues on campus.
Yeah.
We have, our board approved our capital expense budget, and we have over 183 million worth of deferred maintenance items on campus. And 12.6 of that is considered
Is that related to one campus in particular or pretty spread out
across the system. As Dr. Davis mentioned, we do not have a dedicated source for capital in the state. And so we are doing our best to try to meet those needs. Our board requires our campuses to put aside money every year, but we just cannot keep up.
Understandable. Any other questions? Okay. Do I hear a motion to recommend to the full board approval of the economic feasibility for Arkansas State University system? Thank you all.
Chair Baker, I will mention in regard to maintenance and capital projects that we didn't have the recommendations for those at this meeting, but in the near future, probably before our October meeting, we will be bringing you a recommendation for state-funded capital project requests for all the institutions. They're still submitting those to us right now.
Okay, thank you. Do I hear a motion to adjourn the finance committee? Thank you all.